I've lived next door to Mrs. Blackwood for 11 years, and I want to say right now, before I get into any of it, that I understand how this is going to sound. I know what you're going to think. You're going to think I'm the kind of person who sees shapes in static and calls it a face, the kind of person who watches one true crime documentary too many and starts hearing footsteps in an empty house. I get it. I thought that about myself for a long time. I sat with what I saw, what I heard, what I felt, and I turned it over in my hands like a stone you find at the bottom of a river, smooth and heavy and strange, and I told myself there was a reasonable explanation. There is always a reasonable explanation. That's what I told myself every morning for 6 weeks, and every morning I believed it a little less, and now I'm sitting at my kitchen table at 4 in the afternoon on a Tuesday in October and I can feel something pressing down on my shoulders like a hand, like a very large and patient hand, and I think it's time I wrote this down. My name is Daniel Marsh. I'm 38 years old. I'm a high school history teacher, 10th and 11th grade, and I coach junior varsity soccer in the fall, which is how I got into the habit of waking up early. When you have to be on a damp field in Harwick, Massachusetts by 6:15 in the morning, your body stops asking questions and just does it. I've been waking up at 5 without an alarm since 2019. I make coffee, Folgers, the dark roast in the red can. My ex-wife called it criminal and she wasn't entirely wrong, and I sit at the kitchen window in my bathrobe with a mug that says World's Okayest Teacher, a gag gift from my friend Pete, and I watch the street get light. It's a good window for that. Faces east, looks out over my side yard and the narrow strip of grass between my property and Mrs. Blackwood's. I've watched 1,000 dawns from that window. I know the way the maple tree in my yard throws shadows. I know the way the automatic light on the Hendersons' garage across the street flickers before it catches. I know the smell of my neighbor's wood-burning stove in November. I know this neighborhood the way you know a face you've looked at every day for over a decade, which means I knew immediately, on the morning of September the 4th, that something was different. Mrs. Blackwood's property runs along the left side of mine. Her house is older than mine by about 30 years, a narrow 2-story colonial with white clapboard siding that's gone soft gray in places and a covered front porch that she fills with potted geraniums every summer. She's been there longer than I have. The Hendersons across the street say she's been there longer than them, and they've lived in their split level since 1987. Nobody seems to know exactly how old she is. She looks somewhere in her 70s, small, slightly stooped, white hair kept in a tidy bun, always wearing the same style of thing, dark slacks, a cardigan in navy or gray or forest green, sensible shoes with thick rubber soles. She has a garden in the back that she tends with a seriousness I've always admired. She waves when she sees me. Sometimes she leaves tomatoes on my porch, wrapped in a dish towel, without a note. I've shoveled her walk a few times in bad winters without being asked, and she's never acknowledged it, which I figured was just her way. She's not unfriendly, exactly. She's just quiet. She's just contained. She's been my neighbor for 11 years and I realize now, sitting here, that I know almost nothing about her. On the morning of September the 4th, I was at my window at 5:20, maybe 5:25, in that blue-gray early light that happens about 40 minutes before the sun actually clears the tree line. I was on my second cup of coffee, half reading something on my phone, and I looked up because I heard a sound. It was a small sound, the creak of a screen door, and it came from the direction of Mrs. Blackwood's house. I looked out the window and I saw her crossing her side yard. She was moving with purpose, not slowly but not quickly either, the steady pace of someone doing a familiar errand. She was wearing her dark slacks and a gray cardigan and her thick-soled shoes and she was carrying a bucket. A zinc bucket, old-fashioned looking, the kind you see at antique stores or decorating people's front steps with seasonal flowers. She was carrying it in her right hand, held slightly away from her body, and she was walking toward the back of her property where, I know because I've seen it from the upstairs bathroom window, there's an old stone well. I've never thought much about the well. It's covered with a wooden lid, the kind you see on old New England properties, some of them functional, some of them just ornamental. I assumed it was ornamental. I assumed it was dry. I watched her go. The bucket swung easily in her hand. She reached the well, which I couldn't quite see from my angle. The corner of her house blocks part of the view, and I heard the familiar sound of a heavy wooden lid being moved, and then after a minute or so, silence, and then the creak of the lid again, and then she was walking back. She was carrying the bucket in both hands. She was bent slightly forward, her shoulders pulled toward the weight, and she was moving slowly, with effort, each step deliberate and careful, the way you move when you're carrying something that could spill and that you very much don't want to spill. Her fingers, even from where I was sitting 15 feet away and through a window, looked white around the handle. Her jaw was set. She made it to her back porch and set the bucket down and went inside, and the screen door creaked shut behind her, and that was it. 5 minutes from start to finish, maybe less. I thought, she's drawing water. The well must still work. Maybe she uses it for the garden, something about the mineral content, I've heard people say that. I thought nothing else about it. I finished my coffee and got ready for school, and by the time I was backing out of my driveway the whole thing had already slid below the surface of my attention. I'm telling you this because I want you to understand that for the first couple of weeks, I had no sense that anything was wrong. I noticed her, the way you notice a detail in a painting you pass every day and then one morning see for the first time, and then I categorized it and moved on. It was the timing that made me look again. I'm embarrassed about how long it took me to register it, but I was half asleep those first mornings, and I wasn't paying close attention, and it wasn't until I happened to be up very early on a Friday, September the 13th, I noticed the date after the fact, because I had to drive Pete to the airport in Boston for a 5 a.m. flight and I was up at 3 trying to remember where I'd put my car keys. And I looked out the window for no reason, just turned my head toward it, and I saw Mrs. Blackwood crossing her side yard with the zinc bucket in her right hand. It was 3:15 in the morning. I know because I'd just looked at the clock on the microwave. 3:15 a.m., and she was out there in her garden slacks and her cardigan, walking to the well, steady and purposeful, like she was on a schedule. Like this was a perfectly ordinary time to be drawing water from an old stone well in the backyard. I stood at the window and I watched her go, and I watched her come back, bent and laboring under a weight the bucket seemed to contain but gave no evidence of, and I watched her set it on the porch, and I thought, that's strange. And then I thought, maybe she's not sleeping well. Old people sometimes aren't. Maybe she came out to water the garden and I just happened to catch it. Maybe the timing was coincidental. I drove Pete to the airport and didn't think about it again until the following Tuesday, September the 17th, when I woke up at 4 in the morning because I thought I heard something outside and I went to the kitchen window and it was 3:19 and Mrs. Blackwood was already coming back from the well, the bucket in both hands, her back curved under it. I started watching. I feel I should be honest about this, because the watching wasn't comfortable and it wasn't something I'm proud of. I set an alarm for 3 a.m. and I sat at the kitchen window in the dark with my coffee and I waited. She came every night. Sometimes as early as 3:08, sometimes as late as 3:22, but always within that 15-minute window, always with the bucket, always going easy and coming back hard. I watched her for 4 nights in a row and on the 5th night I moved outside, onto my own back porch, bundled in a sweatshirt, because I wanted to hear. I wanted to hear what the bucket sounded like when she set it down. The sound traveled clearly in the still pre-dawn air. It wasn't a clank. It wasn't the light aluminum and nothing sound of an empty vessel touching wood. It was a thud. A deep, resonant, visceral thud that moved through the porch boards and into the soles of my feet, and every time I heard it I felt something trip in my chest, some animal reflex that I couldn't name and couldn't quite suppress. The bucket was empty. I know it was empty because on the morning of September the 21st, a Saturday, I was out early to move some firewood before the rain came in, and Mrs. Blackwood had already gone inside, and her back porch gate was unlatched the way it sometimes is, and without really deciding to I pushed it open and walked across her porch and looked into the bucket she'd left sitting there. It was zinc, old, the galvanized coating gone to flakes in places so the bare metal beneath had gone to rust, the interior dark and dry. The bottom was clear. There was nothing in it, no water, no visible residue, nothing wet, nothing that explained the thud, nothing that explained the weight I'd watched pull at her back and whiten her knuckles every morning for 3 weeks. The inside of the bucket smelled faintly of rust and something else, something mineral and cold, the smell of deep underground water, the smell you get when you lean over an old well. I stood there looking at the empty bottom of that bucket and I noticed that the light hitting it from below seemed somehow wrong. Not wrong in a way I could describe precisely. The sunlight came in from a low angle, the way it does early in the morning, and it should have reflected off the rust and the zinc in a predictable way, but instead it seemed to bend, very slightly, the way light bends in extreme heat, the way you see it shimmer over asphalt in August. Like the air inside the bucket was denser than the air outside it. Like there was something there that light had to move around. I left the porch. I closed the gate. I went inside and I told myself that I was tired and that light does strange things and that I'd been awake at 3 in the morning every night for a week and a half and that nothing strange was happening, that there was a perfectly reasonable explanation. I told myself this approximately every 40 minutes for the rest of that day. I didn't sleep well that night, which had become a pattern. I lay in the dark and I listened to the sounds of the house and at 3:15 I heard the creak of her screen door and I didn't get up. I just lay there and listened. I heard the slow, steady creak of footsteps crossing old porch boards. I heard her gait. I heard the particular rhythm of her walk, purposeful on the way out, halting and strained on the way back. I heard the thud of the bucket on the porch. And then I heard something I hadn't heard before, something I'd missed by being outside rather than inside, by being focused on watching rather than on listening. I heard, after the thud, a long slow sound of liquid. Not dripping. Not splashing. A continuous, low, heavy pour, like someone emptying a very large container slowly, but without any of the usual acoustics of liquid, no splash, no gurgle, no wet resonance. Just the sound of volume moving, impossibly, silently, from one place to another. I should have knocked on her door the next morning. I should have asked if she was all right, if she needed anything. She was an elderly woman doing something unusual in the middle of the night and the neighborly, reasonable, adult thing to do would have been to check on her. I didn't do it. I don't know how to explain why except to say that by then something in me had already decided that I did not want Mrs. Blackwood to know I had been watching, and I did not want to bring her attention to me in any way that broke the current arrangement, which was that she did whatever she did in the small hours of the morning and I watched from a safe distance and we remained, technically, polite neighbors who waved to each other and exchanged tomatoes. On September the 26th I came home from school in the late afternoon and I walked around the side of my house to check on a downspout that had been dripping, and I noticed the grass. The path from Mrs. Blackwood's back porch to the corner of her property, the path she walked every morning, was dead. Not yellowed, not dry brown the way grass gets in August, but black. A strip maybe 18 inches wide and 30 feet long, pressed flat and black. The individual blades of grass dark and brittle and matted into the soil the way they get after a heavy piece of equipment has sat on them for a long time. Like something had been dragged along that path every day, something enormously heavy, dragging and pressing the life out of the ground beneath it. The edges of the path were sharp and clean. On either side the grass was green and healthy. And the path ended at the porch, where the boards were darker than they should have been, where I now noticed there were marks in the wood I hadn't seen before, not scratches exactly but compressions, the kind of marks left by weight sustained over time. I stood at the fence between our properties and I looked at that path for a long time. My shadow stretched west in the afternoon light. Somewhere up the block a kid was riding a bike with a playing card in the spokes, that familiar plastic flutter, rhythmic and ordinary, and I was standing at a chain-link fence looking at dead grass shaped like a wound and thinking about weight that couldn't exist and emptiness that somehow fell like a stone. I went inside and I made dinner and I graded papers and I went to bed, and at 3:15 I heard the screen door and I heard the footsteps and I heard the now familiar rhythm of a small woman walking with something that weighed, impossibly, as much as an engine block, and I heard the thud and I heard the pour that wasn't a pour, and then from beneath that sound, barely audible, I heard her voice. Just her voice, from inside her kitchen, which must have meant she'd brought the bucket inside, which she'd never done before, or perhaps the window was open, or perhaps whatever she was speaking to didn't need to be in the same room to be spoken to. She was saying something in a low, earnest voice. I couldn't make out the words, just the cadence, the rhythm of repetition, the sound of someone negotiating. The sound of someone making an argument they'd made many times before. And then I heard a word clearly. I heard her say please, and she said it the way you say please when you're running out of other options, the way you say it when you're no longer asking but begging, and after that word there was a silence, and then the long, impossible sound of invisible liquid moving. I made a decision on the night of September the 30th that I regret in several different ways but would probably make again. I went out to the well. I did it properly this time, not impulsively. I set my alarm for 2:45, I dressed in dark clothes without entirely knowing why, I eased out my back door and crossed my yard and went through the gate between our properties. The night was cold for September, that first real autumn cold that comes off the ocean and smells like leaves and salt. I positioned myself behind the old Norway spruce at the corner of her yard, close enough to the well that I could see it clearly, and I waited. The wooden lid sat on the stone rim, dark and warped with age, and I noticed now that there was a coil of chain near the base of the well, very old chain, black with oxidation, with a hook at the end that looked handmade and was larger than any hardware store hook I'd ever seen. I noticed that the ground around the base of the well was bare earth. No grass. Not dead grass, no grass at all, bare dark soil in a rough circle maybe 4 feet across, as if nothing had ever grown there, as if the ground itself had decided against it. She came at 3:11. I pressed myself against the trunk of the spruce and I held very still. She walked past me within 8 feet, close enough that I could hear her breathing, which was even and controlled, the breathing of someone who has done a physical thing so many times that their body has learned to manage it in advance. She set the bucket on the edge of the well and she lifted the wooden lid and leaned it against the stone. She attached the hook of the chain to the bucket's handle with the ease of long practice and she lowered it into the well, hand over hand, letting the chain pay out slowly. The chain was long. Much longer than it should have needed to be for an ordinary well. It went down, and I listened for the sound of the bucket hitting water, but instead I heard the chain go taut. Not the soft resistance of water. The sudden, sharp snap of something grabbing. The coil of chain at the base of the well, which had been perhaps 18 inches across, was now fully extended, and Mrs. Blackwood was bracing herself against the stone rim of the well with her hip, leaning back, and the wooden axle of the hand crank above the well was creaking and flexing under tension that should have broken it. Then she began to pull it back up. I watched her haul that chain up hand over hand and I watched what happened to the ground around the well. It started at the rim and moved outward, a slow subsidence, the soil compressing and cracking in a rough spiral the way earth compresses when something is pressing down on it from below. Not from above. From below. The compression moved outward from the well in a rough circle, 4 feet, 5 feet, 6 feet, and it passed under my feet and I felt it through the soles of my shoes, a deep, settled, inexorable pressure, and I locked my knees and I pressed my back against the spruce and I did not make a sound. The bucket came up over the rim and it was empty and the chain went slack and Mrs. Blackwood stood very still for a moment with her eyes closed and I saw the shape around her legs in the starlight. Not smoke. Not fog. Something that the starlight moved around rather than through, a distortion, a presence defined by its refusal to be illuminated, and it covered her feet and rose to her shins and it was moving slowly upward and she said, very quietly, in a voice entirely unlike the pleading voice I'd heard from her kitchen, in a voice that was flat and old and exhausted, "All right then. Come on." And she picked up the bucket in both hands and she walked back toward the house. I stayed behind the spruce for a very long time after she went inside. The ground around the well gradually stopped its slow compressing. The distortion in the air dispersed or became invisible again or did whatever it does when it isn't carrying itself across a dark yard in a zinc bucket. I went back to my house. I didn't sleep. I sat at the kitchen window and watched the sky get light and I thought about all of the reasonable explanations and I discovered that I'd apparently exhausted them somewhere in the previous 2 hours, because I couldn't locate a single one. She didn't come out on the morning of October the 2nd. I was at my window at 3, and at 3:30, and at 4, and she didn't come. The porch light was on, which was unusual, she never left it on overnight. At 6 I made coffee and I tried to decide whether this was any of my business and by 6:30 I decided that 11 years of neighborliness purchased me the right to knock on the door of a woman who lived alone and hadn't appeared when she was reliably appearing at 3 in the morning every day. I told myself this. I knocked on her back door at 7:15. It was unlocked. I mean that it opened when I knocked, the latch not catching, the door swinging inward. I called her name into the kitchen. The kitchen smelled like wood smoke and something else, that same mineral underground smell from the bucket. I called again. Silence. I pushed the door open wider and I went inside and I noticed that the kitchen was very clean, cleaner than a kitchen usually is at 7 in the morning, wiped down and ordered, the counters bare. And in the center of the kitchen floor sat the zinc bucket. I looked at it for a moment and then I walked over and I tried to pick it up by the handle. It didn't move. I mean it didn't move at all, not a millimeter, as if it had been welded to the linoleum or as if it weighed as much as the house around it. I grabbed the handle with both hands and pulled, bracing my feet, and nothing. The bucket sat on the kitchen floor of Mrs. Blackwood's house as immovable as the earth itself, as if gravity had made a specific and personal decision about it. I crouched down and looked at the floor around it and saw that the linoleum was cracked in a circle around the base, fine radiating cracks the color of old porcelain, and the cracks went perhaps 6 inches in all directions from the bucket, as if the floor was slowly giving way beneath it. I looked into the bucket. I have looked into that bucket every night since in my dreams and I will look into it for the rest of my life. The bottom was dark. Not shadowed, the kitchen light was on and I was crouching right over it, but dark the way deep water is dark, the way you look down into something and understand by the quality of the dark that there is more of it below than you can account for. And in that dark, as I held the rim of the bucket and looked down, my face appeared. My reflection. The way a face appears in dark water when you lean over it. But it was wrong. I knew immediately that it was wrong the way you know something in a dream is wrong without being able to say exactly how, that baseline understanding of wrongness that bypasses logic and speaks directly to some older part of you. The face looking back up from the bottom of that empty bucket was mine and it was not mine. It was older, much older, decades older, the skin of it sunken and dry, the eyes the right color but set in hollows I don't have yet and hope never to have, the hair white at the temples and receding in a way that mine isn't, not yet. It was me the way a prophecy is you, technically, eventually, unavoidably. And then I felt the weight. It started in my shoulders. A pressure, an immense and sourceless downward pressure, like someone had placed a hand on each shoulder, and I understood without understanding how I understood that the weight in the bucket was moving. Relocating. I felt my knees begin to flex toward the floor, slowly, the way a structure flexes under load before it fails, and I felt the cracks in the linoleum spreading under my sneakers with a sound like ice on a warming lake, and I gripped the rim of the bucket and I felt the rim was cold, colder than any metal in a warm kitchen should be, cold as river water in March, cold as deep stone. My reflection in the bottom of the bucket watched me from its old face and did not look afraid. It looked like it had been waiting. It looked like it had known I was coming for a very long time. I heard footsteps in the hallway. Light footsteps. Very light footsteps. The footsteps of someone who is no longer carrying anything at all, who has been relieved of something enormous and has become, in its absence, nearly weightless. The footsteps came down the hall toward the kitchen and I let go of the bucket and I stood up, and the weight on my shoulders stayed, and I turned toward the door to the hallway, and I was alone in the kitchen. The hallway was empty. The footsteps continued out of the hallway, through the front room, and I heard the front door of Mrs. Blackwood's house open and close, and then I heard nothing, and I was alone in her kitchen with the immovable bucket and its impossible reflection and the weight that had settled into my shoulders and my spine and my hips like something very old making itself at home. I walked out the back door and across the yard and into my own house. I called the non-emergency police line and I said that my elderly neighbor appeared to be absent from her home and had been somewhat strange in the preceding weeks and I was concerned. 2 officers came. They went through the house. They found nothing. They found no sign of distress, no sign of any crime, no medications left behind that would indicate she departed unexpectedly, no personal items missing in any way that was obviously noteworthy. One of the officers tried to move the bucket. He couldn't. He tried again. He crouched and tried from a lower angle. He got up, adjusted his belt, and said, "Must have been stuck to the floor with something." His partner agreed. They left a number to call if she turned up. I thanked them and watched them drive away and went inside. I've tried to move the bucket twice since then. I can't. I haven't gone back into her house. I don't know where Mrs. Blackwood is. The Hendersons said they saw a light on in her front bedroom 2 nights ago, moving the way a flashlight moves, or the way someone moves through a room in the dark who knows the room well enough not to need the overhead. I didn't see it. I was asleep. I'd taken a Benadryl and I was asleep by 9, the dreamless pharmaceutical kind, and I woke up at 3:15 on the dot without an alarm and I lay in the dark and I listened. The yard was quiet. No screen door. No footsteps. No chain. No thud. No impossible sound of invisible things being moved from one place to another. Just the wind in a maple tree and a car going by on Elm Street 3 blocks away and the weight across my shoulders that hasn't left since the morning I crouched over that bucket and looked at my own old face looking back at me from its dark and impossible bottom. It's not pain. That's what I want to say, in case that's what you're picturing. It doesn't hurt. It just presses. It presses constantly, steadily, with the patient, impersonal force of something that knows it has all the time in the world. I've been to my doctor and I sat in the office and I tried to explain the sensation and Dr. Antonelli nodded and said, "Could be tension, could be the start of something arthritic, let's take some images, let's run some panels," and the images came back normal and the panels came back normal, and I sat in his office a second time and he said, "It's probably stress," and he said it the way doctors say things when they mean, "I have done what I can and whatever this is, it is not mine to solve. I've been doing research." The kind of research you do when you've run out of sensible avenues and you're starting to look at the stranger shelves. I've found references, old ones, in texts about New England folk practice and older documents still, to the idea that certain presences, not spirits exactly, not ghosts in the way we usually use the word, but weight, that certain accumulations of weight, of time, of something that has no good name in English, can be drawn and contained and moved. That they must be tended. That if the tending stops, the weight redistributes. I found one account from a journal dated 1887, written by a woman in coastal Maine, about her grandmother who drew water every morning from an old well and carried it to the house and the water was never in the bucket, and when the grandmother died the woman found the bucket in the kitchen and couldn't lift it, and she wrote, "I have taken the bucket out and covered the well and I pray this is enough." She didn't say whether it was. I covered the well last week. I found the wooden lid in Mrs. Blackwood's yard and I put it back on the stone rim and I put a cinder block on top of it for good measure, and I felt, briefly, a slight lessening of the pressure in my shoulders. Just for a moment. Then it settled back. I don't know what that means. I don't know if the well was the point or if it was just a location, a door, a specific geography where a particular transaction had been happening for a very long time and might or might not continue to happen without my involvement. Mrs. Blackwood has been gone for 12 days. The tomatoes in her garden are going bad on the vine. The geraniums on the front porch are dead. I still wake up at 3:15 every morning. Exactly 3:15, my eyes opening into the dark with a precision that has nothing to do with any alarm I've set. And I lie there for a while, on my side, not moving, and I listen to the house, and then I hear it. From the direction of the backyard, from the direction of the stone well under its cinder block and its old wooden lid, a sound. Not a screen door. Not footsteps. Just a sound, low and sustained, the sound of something very heavy being lifted from a very great depth, and then set down somewhere near me, and it is getting closer each night, I think. Whatever it is, wherever it goes during the day, I think it is orienting. I think it has a sense of me now, the same sense I have of it, the sense you develop of something you've been near for long enough. I can feel, even now in the afternoon with the sun still up and my neighbors moving around in their yards and the ordinary world arranged exactly as it usually is, I can feel the moment it will arrive the way you feel weather coming before the sky shows it, in your bones, in your joints, in the places where your body is oldest. I'm leaving the light on tonight.